Oh, well, I mean, don't start me.
The TMO is killing rugby. Let's be quite blunt about it.
This is Rugby Unity. I am David Pembroke, and joining me first up today, Eddie Jones. Eddie, we covered the France-Ireland game last week, but there were two other matches to complete the first round of the Six Nations. Give me the three things that you took away from Italy's win over Scotland.
Well, I think as we mentioned, Pemby, the first 20 minutes of the game was going to be instrumental, and Italy got off to a pretty rampant start. Played their very low phase but high production rugby, a lot of kicking, a lot of good kicking, whereas Scotland were the opposite. They played long phases, and I thought that, the contrast in the playing style was the one thing between Italy and Scotland. Then secondly, the physicality of Italy, their consistency over the 36 minutes of ball in play or whatever it was really, really impressive. And then thirdly, I thought the lack of influence that Finn Russell had in the game. He's one of the best 10s in the world, but struggled to have any sort of influence in the game.
Ewen, McKenzie, your thoughts on Italy's 18 points to 15 win over Scotland in the wet in Rome?
Well, the weather didn't help, but I tipped Italy. I thought that they, I was impressed with them last year, and they've continued. They had a really bright start to the game, some great tries. But when you look at the statistics, Scotland had all the ball carries and a lot of the field position. So I had a look at it in that context. And the thing that impressed me was the Italians' resilience in defence. They were not just willing, but they had really good body position. And I was watching the contest, particularly in the forwards, in general play. And the Italians are very good. They're very physical in defence, all of their players, backs as well. And they exposed Scotland. I thought Scotland looked a bit sloppy in their forward play as a result. A bit high in the clean out. All those things matter. So when you look at then go through the statistics, Italy made 5 line breaks, Scotland made none. So Scotland carried the ball twice as often as Italy did, but no line breaks. So you can hide things in statistics. Scotland had plenty of possession, opportunity, field position. They just weren't able to make anything out of it, whereas Italy was quite good at, they better in Scotland at puncturing the line and were quite skillful in scoring a couple of tries. So not much in it other than that. The weather didn't really allow that, but they didn't. I was impressed. Italy's on the rise, and I don't know where Scotland's up to, as we've discussed last week and the week before.
So let's go through a few of those things. And obviously the match was played in very, very trying conditions, very wet. And I would also have to say that it was an impressive crowd in Rome. No gaps, no at all. It looked like certainly a very enthusiastic home support there for the Italian team, which is hopefully a very good thing and a good sign. But what about Scotland? What about that? The way that they started the game?
Oh, well, I think that's the way they play. And they backed themselves to play like that. Obviously, the conditions made it difficult, but they like to move the ball. They like to have a lot of passing in their game. They like a lateral game. That's the way they play. And in those conditions, it was very difficult, very difficult. Along with that, mate, you can probably play like that reasonably successful in those conditions if your scrum and line out's good. Again, their scrum and line out were both under pressure for most of the game. They got the young hooker Ashman, who's an outstanding rugby player, but most good young hookers who are good players, their throwing isn't much good. It takes them a while to learn how to throw.
Okay, so Eddie Jones, then. Let's go back to that Ashman, the hooker. Clearly, problems with the throws. But Eddie Jones, at this level, though, don't you think that the Scottish team and certainly the Scottish supporters should have some expectation that they will have a functioning line-out and scrum?
Oh yeah, but mate, it's a highly competitive area, and Italy have improved enormously in both those areas. And I think, part of Italy's success goes back to Kieran Crowley of what he did at Benetton. If you go back 8 years ago, and this is a consistent theme. We spoke about France, what they've done, changed the way they set up their top 14 sides, gave young players an opportunity, and they brought these players through. Now, Italy are a little bit different. They've only got two teams, Zebra and Benetton. But if you go back 8 years, Benetton were at the bottom of the table about 8 years, couldn't win a game, were pretty much hopeless. Kieran Crowley came in, and with 3 years, he created a functioning team, brought through a lot of these young players. And if you look at that Italian team now, the base of it's from Benetton. So they've built their resources up, built their playing depth up over a period of time. Scotland, have a similar situation where they've got two teams, and they've been through a good period. Scotland, they've had good players, probably some of the best players they've seen for a period of time, and they're probably just coming off their peak, and they've got some young guys coming through and learning their craft like an Ashman.
So where to from here for Scotland?
Well, I think Scotland will dig down more into their game. That's the way they like to play, and when the conditions are right and they can get parity in their set piece, they'll still be a difficult team to beat. And I think, they'll lick their wounds, set themselves up for whoever they got next. Who have they got next?
They play England at home.
Okay, so there's no better game for them to prepare for than England at home. I think they've got a pretty good record there over the last period of time. It's the biggest grudge match in probably World Rugby apart from Australia and New Zealand. Where both teams, don't particularly like each other. The supporters tend to be pretty rampant. I remember Neil Craig being hit by a water bottle, when we went there about 6 or 7 years ago. So, they get stuck into it a fair bit.
All right, so that was, a particularly good win, a promising start, an encouraging start there for Italy, but Scotland, plenty to work on. The next big match of the weekend, which closed out the first round, was England's comprehensive win, 48 points to 7 over Wales. The three things that you took from that match?
I only had one, mate. Industrial revolution versus technology revolution. So watching England, they remind me of industrial revolution. They're efficient, they're productive. They play with a lot of common sense, a lot of physicality, and a lot of England. And then I found the game to be completely tedious. When we got down to 15 versus 13, the first 20 minutes of the game, whatever it was, I lost a bit of interest in the game. I thought the refereeing was the worst of the technology revolution. And what I mean by that was that basically the TMO ran the game. So the TMO picks out things in the game that he wants to correct. But if he's going to do that, why doesn't he correct everything? And I think it's a huge problem in our game. The yellow-red cards, I think England must have scored at least 3 or 4 of their tries in the periods where Wales had the yellow or red cards. And I'm not saying they weren't right, but we had a situation where the referee was completely being refereed by the TMO. And every decision was second-guessed, and the players know that. The players know that. They can feel that on the field. And it just, to me, it spoiled a game of rugby, and I didn't enjoy the game at all. Like, good win from England. Wales have got, as we know, got a lot of work to do. But when you're batting with 13 men in a game of rugby, you're always doing it tough.
So let's go to that, though. Around, the 15 on 13, what choice did the referee Pierre Brousset have, given that Wales were clearly struggling to compete and therefore they were constantly breaking the laws, giving penalties away just to stay in the game. What choice should or could the referee have had to be able to reward England's dominance but retain parity by numbers, and also to punish Wales at the same time because they were unable to compete?
Well, I think the point to me is that, sure, you've got to penalise obvious yellow cards, but cynical fouls around the goal line, does everything have to result in a yellow card? Yeah, because once we go to 15 verse 13, we destroy the contest. The contest is over. It ceases to be a game of rugby. And I think we've got to try to keep the integrity of the game of rugby, which is 15 verse 15. So he just keeps penalising him. And at some stage, maybe he's got to go to the yellow card. But I just thought it was just too quick and too early in the game, and it destroyed the game of rugby. And as I said, when I started to watch that game, which I watched on replay, for some reason I got the telecast here that had the direct communication between the TMO and the referee. And in all honesty, it really annoyed me the whole game. And I struggled to stay to watch the game. Obviously I watched it because I've got interest in both the teams, but as a spectator, I would have turned it off. Because the thing about this, Pemby, the other thing about it is that the TMO, once he decides he's going to referee the game, then why doesn't he pick out every discrepancy in the game? Like, I'm watching the game and I'm seeing other penalties that he doesn't pick up, but he picks up some things. Like, obviously at the start of the game, they made a big decision. They were going to be really hard on the kicking space. So every player that was offside in the kicking space was penalised, and the TMO was looking carefully at that. I thought it was a bad advertisement for rugby.
Ewen McKenzie, were you able to watch the game at the weekend?
Oh, well, I mean, don't start me. I was watching different games on the weekend. Look, I mean, you had 6 yellow cards in one game and none on the others, and the other ones were sort of enjoyable to watch, I've just picked up on what Eddie was saying. It was very frustrating and difficult to stay the course. The result was what we thought, but in the end it was a sort of it feels like a contrived result because you're just playing, with so few people on the field, and it's just a mismatch, So, with a big scoreline, it's ridiculous. The statistic, when you look at the stats, there's a lot of similar stats. When you go through, I went and looked at the stats for all the games, and when you go through it, you see a lot of similarities. So Wales weren't that inferior, but you get this lopsided result because you get 13. There's a couple of tries scored, 13 when it's 15 on 13. There's a bit of a square up late in the game with some yellow cards against England, but basically the damage is already done.
What's your solution? Because I was watching the game and thinking to myself, he's got to do something, because this is clearly England are dominant here. Wales are struggling. What else might he have been able to do to try to keep 15 against 15, but to reward England's dominance and to punish Wales' inferiority?
Yeah, that's the difficult thing, and that's where they've got to work out. And I think I saw it in one of the other games where someone got carded and then they had to bring someone back on. Like, it was sort of like, so there wasn't a mismatch in numbers, but that's what they've got to look at overall and work out. I mean, England played to an advantage in the game. They were going really well on the maul, and so they put a lot of pressure on, and that's what you're meant to do in the game. You're meant to find an advantage and then exploit it. I get the yellow cards, but I don't think it adds to the. I don't know. There's something about the speckle. I know what you're saying. What does he do? But it just seemed to be like, I saw other games where the referee, avoided. We talked about in the France game with Dupont, like avoided trying to give yellow cards to try to keep the numbers fair, and it made for a better game. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. I think the answer. I don't have the answer. I wish I could say, but you do have to go to yellow cards eventually. There's no doubt about that. But it just made the game a bit hard to watch, as a spectacle. So, I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'll have to think more about it. But I think the answer's off the field. The administrators need to think about that. You need to, if you take someone off, you put someone on, keep the numbers equal. It depends on the nature of the offence too, whether it's cynical versus foul play. I think foul play, there has to be some sort of penalty against the team. But if it's the cynical stuff, maybe they just got to replace players on the field. That's the only really other answer. There's no other way to deal with it after you sanction them after the game. But for team sanctions, they've had that in when I was playing in France. They had cards for team. They'd send the winger off. The captain was always the winger. The captain was always the winger because they had a card for it where the team was sanctioned for all in brawls and things like that. So they'd send the captain off, and so the captain was always the winger. So he got sent off. Happened all the time because there's always an all-in brawl, like in the lower divisions of French rugby. There's always an all-in brawl at some point in the game, and so the sanction was a white carder from memory, a white card, and they just send the captain off. So the captain was always the winger. He wasn't the captain, but he was always the captain in name.
And your sort of the three things that you took perhaps from the England and Wales game, aside from the involvement of the TMO. And the referee and the yellow cards?
Well, England didn't surprise. We've got the what I'd call the reinvention of Ford. He's now when you look again, I do look at the statistics. You try and get that, doesn't tell you everything. There's always bits and pieces that are hidden, but Ford's got the right sort of game for how it's been played at the moment. So he had 40 something kicks in the game. He was like 75% of those, and it's a matter of the kick pass to the wing. The wingers are back. If you look across the games, who's scoring the tries? It's the wingers. So, last few years, the last bunch of years, it's been the hookers scoring tries off the back of rolling mauls and things like that. Now we're getting these kick passes, and Ford's was good at taking his options there, and his wingers were scoring. So that was impressive. So his role in sort of managing the game, he's sort of become, the sort of guy that was maybe going to be in a team, maybe not. So now he seems to be first choice, and there's all these other star players who are more flamboyant, aren't getting the starts. And then, but England they've got the right playmaker, they've got the right aerial contest guys, and they feature, and then they've got a great bench. That's the thing for me. And tactically, they obviously targeted them all. That paid off for them. And they stuck at it, but they've got a good bench to finish the game. The refereeing was pretty good. There's a couple of things that that I thought were sort of trivial, or the neck roll by Dickie Cowan, things like that. That I thought just TMO getting involved in the game for no particular reason. But that was it. They were just dominant, and we expected that. We talked about that the other day. And they proved it. So we roll on. So we're getting down to there's going to be a couple of big games. It's still for England. The Scotland game it doesn't matter what Scotland's doing. They'll front up on that day. So there's 2 or 3 big games to come, and that's going to decide how it rolls out.
And your thoughts on Wales?
Well, again, statistically they weren't that far off England. Like you can find parts of the game. Statistically, they had their carries and whatever. They just haven't got the finesse and the detail. There were moments there, and they were willing, but they didn't have the technical capacity to defend the maul, for instance. But they're there. They'll be garnering experience. You just like to think they're a year ahead of where they are. They're probably a year off, too early or too late for this next World Cup, I think. But hopefully they're just going to keep accruing experience and build a bit of depth at the same time. But they're a fair way behind everyone else. But they've also got the youngest team, so you've got to hope in 4 years' time that they're going to be on the rise and other teams are going to be on the back of the hill.
So, Eddie Jones, how do we get consistency? How do we make sure that the 3 games in the Six Nations played at the weekend are played under similar instruction?
Well, I think to go back to just Ewan's point, and just looking at some stats here, about 56% of all yellow and red cards are for professional fouls and for persistent infringements. So that's a high percentage. So can you penalise a team by when there's a professional foul or persistent infringement, which is a persistent infringement is a team foul. It's not an individual foul. And that's half of the 55%. So how can you penalise a team for that without taking a player off the field? So one of the things might be that the opposition could choose a player that goes off. For instance, I'm just coming up with some ideas here.
That's a good idea.
So persistent infringement goes to the captain, right? We've given them a warning. They're still infringing. Which player would you like to go off the field? So he says, right, DuPont off. So DuPont goes off. Seren comes on for 10 minutes. Like something like that may help the game retain its integrity, because that game lacked integrity, mate. It lacked everything we like about rugby. And I think what needs to change is we need some leadership, mate. The TMO is killing rugby. Let's be quite blunt about it. That wasn't a good game for rugby on the weekend. And I think they need to show leadership. They need to say we need the referee to referee the game. Ben O'Keefe did it. Karl Dickson did it to a great extent, and they were good games of rugby. And I think we need to have that leadership from World Rugby. They should be coming out today and putting an edict out about how the game's going to go forward. It's leadership.
Ewen McKenzie.
Yeah, I agree with what Eddie said. They've got to do something. You can't have sort of embarrassing outcomes like that. People pay a lot of money to turn up and watch, and broadcasters pay, and then you get this sort of this. We've talked about this last year, so they need to think it through, and it's a good idea. I mean, it's just sort of Eddie off the cuff there with the idea of the team that's getting offended against gets to choose a player. I mean, but they can still keep the numbers even. You bring the replacement on, and then. Yeah, if that doesn't work, then you say, well, if you bring the replacement on, you can't use him later in the game tactically. So there's a bunch of things that they can do to try and get discipline, because you see it all the time, particularly teams defending. They'll infringe, and once they've infringed, there's a penalty. They'll just keep infringing. And then the team scores. And so there's been 3 or 4 penalties, clear penalties, from the defensive team. The team scores a try, and they go back, kick the conversion, and the game goes on. So you've had 4 penalties in that period that don't ever get arbitrated, yet other things around the game are clearly arbitrated, over-arbitrated at times too. So there's not equity in all that. But fundamentally, you have to also think about what's the fan viewing here. Like if we're trying to be competitive with other sports and whatever, what are we watching? That's got to be part of it. Yeah, there's the fundamentals of the game that we like and talk about. But you've got to make sure that the fans involved in the decision making, in other words, the fans getting value for money, is entertained, whatever. But they're going to be games where there's mismatches, and that's what happens in sport. There's always a winner and a loser, generally speaking, and so you can't. You've got to be able to reward that. So that there's a bit of thinking to be done. This is not the first time we've talked about this. So I think that they need to get on with it. And the point that Eddie makes about leadership is that's. The big sports is that they'll just deal with it. They'll get out there and they'll make some decisions and get on with it. That's leadership, rather than just let it meander into some sort of conference that happens in November, and then at the end of November, and then suddenly it becomes part of the World Cup 2 weeks out. That's what happens. Like that's in 18 months' time. 2 weeks out of the World Cup, they suddenly get a whole bunch of new things that teams have got to try and adapt to.
Well, we do know that World Rugby's new head of rugby, Mark Robinson, although he hasn't yet taken up his formal role, is currently conducting a review to be, and with the outcomes to be presented at the State of the Game conference in February for adoption. And this is really the last opportunity for substantive change ahead of the 2027 Rugby World Cup. Eddie Jones, if you were sitting in the room with Mark Robinson, give us your pitch and your appeal about what has to change in order for us to develop and implement and present the best possible version of rugby.
I think, yeah, if you look at what Super Rugby's doing, and there's got to be a lot of hats off to Super Rugby. They've got a deliberate way they want to try to increase the ball in play, decrease the ball out of play. So that's your objective. Your objective's got to be, can we increase ball in play? Can we increase ball out? Can we decrease ball out of play? And then the third part's got to be, how can we keep the integrity of the game? So if we agree the integrity of the game's trying to keep 15 on 15, then there's those three pillars you've got to look at. And I think Super Rugby's done a good job in trying to increase the ball in play and decrease the ball out of play. But the last piece is integrity. And I think if you look at the stats, which we just had a quick look at there, we could take away 20% of that yellow-red card with the persistent infringements by coming up with some sort of solution where the player has to be replaced and maybe the opposition team get the decision to say it. And I think if they look at those three areas, they can improve the game pretty quickly. And then they've got to back their referees 100%.
Yeah, well, I think there is the opportunity, though, now through this review to get those clear, consistent instructions. And Eddie Jones, we will let you go off to catch a plane off to the first of the Japan under-23 camps ahead of an Australian tour later in the year. So, Eddie Jones, thanks very much for joining us again today.
We're not talking rugby, we're building it. Rugby Unity.
So there he is, Eddie Jones, on his way to camp with his under-23 team. Had a highly successful tour of Australia last year, and I was talking to Eddie over the weekend, and he discovered on last year's tour about 3 players who he thinks may feature in the Japanese Rugby World Cup squad for 2027. So again, he is in search of the next 3 players to make up that particular squad. So Ewen McKenzie, for you, we've had Eddie Jones. He's put his hand up, and that's what he's had to say at the Mark Robinson conversations ahead of the State of the Game. What would your presentation to Mark Robinson be?
The same as Eddie in terms of leadership in that space. The only thing the ad, and we started on it last week about the contest in the game, about where that sits. Talked about that in the line-out in the French game. Saw some really good contests in the other games. So we just need to have a clear edict about where that sits. We talked about last year a lot about the scrum, this year about the line-out. So that's something they need to also work out about where that is. And so the referee's got a role to play, but in the end it needs to come from World Rugby. So there's just a few things there that are bugging us around the game, and I think that's where they've got to show some leadership. And otherwise, because we've got to compare it. Look, it's a competition out there. It's a competition for the hearts and minds of young kids and whatever. So we've got to present something that looks right, and it doesn't look right when you just got players going. You don't see that in other sports where players are just disappearing off the field. And, fans are sitting at the game, if they weren't watching for that millisecond, wouldn't know. They've got to watch the big screen to work out what's going on. And there's all these conversations going on with referee and TMOs and whatever. And you don't see that in other sports. You do see in the micro stuff in like American football and whatever. There's a lot of analytical things going on. But they're attuned to that sort of sport. We're not in – the rest of the world's not in that sort of market. I know they're trying to push that, but everyone else is looking for continuity, looking to be entertained, And we're looking, as a sport, we're trying to capture the hearts and minds of young kids who you want to play that sport. So they want to be excited by it, not perplexed. So at the moment, it's a perplexing thing from a viewership point of view. You don't know what you're going to get. So we'll see. Hopefully, it's a one-off. I've seen, the referees handling what would have been last year's yellow card moments better in the other games. Then they weren't yellow cards, and the game just flowed on. So I think that there's been some conversations and whatever. And I think that hopefully it's a one-off, and it sort of becomes a bit more mainstream in terms of how the other two games were refereed.
But I just wonder, why is it so difficult to get consistency? So is it you have two good games on the weekend, and then you have a third game that was a challenging watch, given that there was the mismatch with players on the field and there was a heavier involvement of the TMO in the England-Wales game? Well,
it does depend on the nature of the game. There was clearly a dominance, particularly maul time, for England, and they played to that, which is what you would do if you had an advantage. And so it's also up to the teams have got a role to play. I'm not trying to absolve the teams. They've got to have some sort of responsibility in terms of how they conduct themselves. And I was going to say it in the French game with Ireland. The French were dominant for 50 minutes in that game, and a lot of the time you see the Irish, they're dabbling around the back of the ruck, doing things right, which was penalisable. The referees tolerate it. They'll have someone there, and the referee has to tell them to get out of the way so the halfback can move the ball. And so there's this sort of faux ruck contest stuff, but it's always around the back of the ruck, so it slows the play down, allows defence to get organised. It's not a fluke, right? It happens. And so because the French were so dominant, the Irish resorted to that, but it's been in their DNA for some time. So the referee could have penalised the things and done it, but he didn't, and he let the game go. And my point is that teams they've got to try and play the game with the best intentions. Yeah, you're going to try and push it, but you can't just do stupid things. And I saw stupid things on the weekend. I saw poor, in the Scottish game, same thing with the Scottish forwards, the lack of precision and whatever. So that you're going to be precise in defence, precise in attack. So there's an obligation on teams to be able to contribute in that way. These are the pinnacle teams of each of their countries. They've got to try and contribute in a precise and professional way as well. So you can't just go, we're getting beaten, so we just resort to stupidity. So let's not absolve the teams from their contribution in that. They've got to get better at it. Like if England exploits Wales at ball time, guess what the next team's going to do? The same. So Wales have to get better at that. Like that's part of it as well. It's not just about the refereeing or the World Rugby. It's also about the team's contribution to the performance.
And so perhaps in summary, one thought that you take out of the first round of the Guinness Six Nations as we get underway for 2026?
Well, the rise of as I said, the kick pass to the wing and the kick contest, things that were there last year have become more prevalent. But that's bringing the wingers into the game, and it's exciting. That's skill execution by whoever kicks the ball. But the ability to kick wide and chase. So there's some tactics there that have been clearly exploited, and that's now showing up as mainstream. And I think it's a bit more interesting to watch than watching driven mauls and things like that. That's still part of the game. We saw England exploit that, but that was everyone's go-to to score tries, and now we're seeing a bit more. So that's probably the big takeaway from the first thing. And also the 2 out of 3, the referees I thought were very balanced in their adjudication. So I'm encouraged by that's going to lead to more sort of genuine contests across the tournament.
And certainly plenty to look forward to in the second round this weekend. Ireland takes on Italy, Scotland taking on England, and France against Wales. And we will speak and preview those matches later in the week as we get through that. So anyway, to the third voice, which is where you have your opportunity to have your say for this podcast, which has one very simple mission. How do we help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world? And how do you make your contribution? And on this program, you do it through what we call the third voice. And so some of the commentary, Henny Kotz has said, wow, to hear the head of rugby take questions from one of the best rugby brains in Eddie Jones is brilliant, makes us die-hard rugby fans have hope for the future. Dime Till Death on YouTube says, quality stuff here. D. Witten from Northern Ireland, I love the opinions from former coaches, which isn't readily available elsewhere. And indeed, Marvin on YouTube has asked, maybe if we could get Eddie Jones and Ewen McKenzie to give us an insight into what they feel will the tactics be in the upcoming matches. So on Friday's preview match, we'll get Ewen and Eddie to think about the tactical approaches of Ireland against Italy, Scotland and England, France against Wales. So they can take you into the minds of coaches and the way that they think about the game. And Zed Hendricks from the USA says, I love the frank and honest conversations and answers from people that may have seen how the sausage gets made. So to questions from Martin Tyler, Ewen McKenzie, do you think playing in the drier conditions in Australia in Rugby World Cup 2027 will disadvantage the Northern Hemisphere sides and benefit the Southern Hemisphere sides?
I would have, 30 years ago, I would have said yes. That would have been because the conditions were very different. You used to play on muddy fields and the whole bit. But these days, the venues that they play at are very manicured and, they're almost pristine. So there'll be some wear and tear due to the tournament, but I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think that players at this level travel around and play in different parts of the world often. So and they'll be here acclimatising. They'll get used to the conditions. The bounce of the ball, things like that, but are relevant, but not significant. I don't think that'll be a big factor.
Okay, Greg Lee, through the survey that we do have available to all of you listeners, so you can jump into the description section and download and fill out the survey. It helps us to understand a little bit more about your views and what it is that you would like us to discuss here on Rugby Unity. But Greg Lee asks, how do we convince those in charge of grassroots rugby to help grow the game and invest funds in the right area? I've gone from Sydney rugby to rugby in the central west of New South Wales, and it's chalk and cheese. Volunteerism is dwindling. Ewen McKenzie, how do we reignite it?
Well, I think, if you look at I'm looking at the club scene, say in Sydney, and I think that's been going very well. That's, in a urban context, that's been going very well. But I think that society's leaning that way now. I think people are more inclined to give less. But, I see in other things outside of sport, fire brigade, also there's lots of volunteers out there doing things. So it's probably more a function of, it's not about reward. It's just it's probably a trend that's been there, even in terms of participation in the game. And so it's probably a trend away. People are finding other things to do with their time. And that's where we talked about the hearts and minds earlier on. We're in a competition for hearts and minds and people to put, and we all play the game. In my day, we all played the game primarily and firstly because we love playing the game. So we were all participated in that level of rugby, and we played. You played for nothing, and you were surrounded by people who were giving their time for nothing. So, and that was one of the beauties of it. So I think that's a challenge now in the so-called professional. We'll call it professional so that they get paid. That's now sucking up resources, but it sucks up people as well, and then they're less inclined to drop back and do stuff. But I can see what you're saying, but I also see that the club competition's been strong now out west. That's a different story. It's probably it's always been a participation battle out there. It's always between rugby league and rugby union who's got which player's going to play where. Some used to play Saturdays and Sundays, play both. But yeah, I can see that can be a problem over time. I don't actually know the solution. All you can do is try and make the sport attractive again, so that people are attracted to it as a spectacle. And if it's good entertainment, then kids will want to play. Kids want to play. They have to go. The parents have to go. If they're going to be there, they'll run the barbecue, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of builds that way. You've got to get the kids' heart. You've got to get the kids, and they'll bring their families, So you've got the kids. So the kids have to be interested in the game, and, they like to see heroes on the TV and the like. They like to touch and get signatures and things like that. So the job of everyone is to try and make the spectacle. So World Rugby's got to make the spectacle that's interesting and comparable and competitive with other sports out there. Otherwise, they'll watch other sports and then they'll end up participating in other sports.
Yeah, for mine, I think there needs to be a clear and deliberate effort and being quite intentional across the sport about exactly, well, how do you strategically address what some of these challenges are? But I would have thought that, as the baby boomers start to retire, and many baby boomers would have played rugby union through school, through club, entered their careers, had their careers, and maybe coming out the other end of their careers, that it's the ideal time for them to reconnect back into the game and to give something back, and for their health to be able to get out and whatever it is that they might do. There's lots of physical activity that needs to be undertaken around a rugby club. So I think as people start to think about what are they going to do to fill in their days, perhaps going back to their rugby club and making a contribution now that they do have a little bit more time on their hands, could be a very useful way of re-engaging and making a contribution to a sport that perhaps has given them something. And while they were in their professional careers, they may not have had the time to do it. So just a thought, Boomers, maybe time to go back. Boomer, come back. Let's call it that.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I know lots of people professionally who I deal with who love to go and sit on the hill and watch the local rugby club play. They're not necessarily members of the club, but they just like to go and play. It's their release. So you're right about the generational thing. So that you're probably coming off a generation that did participate and have been distracted by, the work life and whatever else, and there's an opportunity. So a campaign to target those people who are going into retirement is not a bad idea.
Yeah, no, I think that'd work. And I think that people get an enormous amount from it and be able to give back to the community, and particularly here in Australia as we get ready for 2027, because I think all rugby fans in Australia need to take some responsibility for the tournament. It's not just going to be World Rugby. It's not just going to be Rugby Australia. It's not just going to be the clubs. But I think if you count yourself as some sort of rugby fan in any way, shape or form, how are you going to contribute to make Rugby World Cup in Australia a success in 2027?
Well, that's how the Olympics do. The Olympics do that, don't they? They get a whole bunch of volunteers that meet and greet people at the airport, and they give them a bit of a uniform or some sort of recognition. But there's a heap of volunteers that go in around. So that's hopefully that's part of the program, to try and attract volunteers into the World Cup. But then beyond that, hopefully they'll drift back into their club scenario. So maybe they should be rewarding people from the club environments with roles in the World Cup. Yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions from D. Witten has been contributing, so thank you so much, D. Witten from Northern Ireland. A couple of questions from him. Eddie's not here, but to you, Ewan, do you think the recent jackal laws have actually reduced the ability for teams to attack from deep?
Don't know. I don't know about the correlation. Attack from deep, you mean getting isolated and then I don't know if that's the laws or just people's skill set. I don't think that's in play. We saw some good attack from deep on the weekend, so I don't know that there's a direct correlation. I just think that teams have got better at getting over the ball. I still thought there was some iffy, indecision and some poor decisions around that the jackling side. We saw some really good examples of, I think in the Ireland Italy game, there's some great things, and they didn't get rewarded. And I've seen other ones. I saw Ty Byrne lying on the ground, handing the ball back and getting a penalty for jackling, not for So I'm not quite sure if the laws are properly interpreted yet, but it's much clearer for the players, and so therefore it's becoming a skill set that's becoming useful. But I don't think it's endangering people. The game's always been you can't get isolated. So yes, on a counter-attack situation you can't get isolated. So that's all about support players doing something. So that hasn't really changed.
And a final question from D. Witten. When coaching, how do you coach a specific thing? For example, width in your defence line without having to consistently revisit, i.e. how do you make a message stick?
Well, there's coaching skill, which takes some time to develop a skill. That takes a long time, and that's just persistence. And you can break that skill right down to its subset, and there's lots of creative ways to be able to develop that. In terms of team play, something like defensive patterns or whatever, they need to be practiced collectively, and also obviously collectively in terms of any patterns, but also under pressure. So you've got to be able to recreate that in that environment in training, and that's where live training is good. I mean, live training without contact, but you've got to try and create the environment so that you can actually put the players under pressure and they make decisions. And defence is all about that, and you can see, as I talked before about the kick pass now to the winger is prevalent. The kick pass to the winger and the outside centre grubbering through with the winger chase. That was prevalent on the weekend. It was there last year, but I think it's going to become more and more part of the tactics. It's that's in a way a lot of it's from rugby league, or rugby league is borrowing from us. They're obvious tactics, and it's bringing the wingers back into the game. But you got to practice that, and it's very difficult. But you practice that as a unit. That's what the backs or whoever it is would be practicing that. But you got to practice it in a live environment so that you actually get it right. But none of it's precise. That's different from learning a closed skill as an open skill, closed skill. Whereas line out throwing, you have line out throwing to the line out, but you've also just got the skill of throwing the ball and being accurate with that. So you can practice that separately, but then you've got to be able to practice in the live environment where there's line out with a contest and the like. So you've got to do all of that in the limited time you've got. In a week-to-week sense, you've got to develop their base skills, but also develop the tactical skills that you need for that week. So it's therein lies the decisions for head coaches and assistant coaches.
So thank you once again, Third Voice, for contributing those questions and comments once again, and we look forward to you continuing to provide those for us, an important part of the program. Ewen McKenzie, you mentioned time there, and one of our contributors, Third Voice, Dom Varley from Hong Kong, decided to do a little bit of work with ChatGPT, having a look at the distances that different teams will travel in the preliminary rounds of the Rugby World Cup. And there are some significant differences. And last week you were talking about Japan having 3 6-day turnarounds. Well, the team that will be travelling the furthest during the opening rounds of Rugby World Cup, Hong Kong, China, 7,670 kilometres. The team travelling the least, and they'll be going from Perth to Townsville to Melbourne. The team travelling the least is Portugal. They'll be travelling from Sydney to Newcastle to Brisbane for 1,050. The team travelling the second longest distance is Samoa, 6,740 kilometres, Newcastle, Perth and Sydney. And the second lowest distance travel will be Fiji, Newcastle, I can't even read my own writing there, somewhere, and Adelaide for 1,321. Japan, mid-table, 16th. Newcastle, Brisbane, Adelaide, for 2,492. So you can go to our Substack, the Rugby Unity Substack, and see all of the distances to be travelled by those teams. Ewen McKenzie, the top number, 7,670. The bottom number, 1,050. How much of an advantage is it that you are not travelling in the first couple of weeks of the Rugby World Cup?
No, I mean, it's great that research has been done. It's interesting. I like to understand that, but it's now you need to take that and then add it to the time gaps between each game to see what that looks like. So who's actually got the most amount of preparation time versus the least amount. As I said, Japan, I think 6-day preparation. So what's that? If you take 6 days, that's 18 days. So I'd be interested. So I can work it out myself, I guess, if I sat down. But I mean, they're all things, and you try and put all those things together. So who's got the raw prawn? But the reality is that as much as the distances are there, that's time in the air. But you've also got basically they're all airport transfers when you look at it. Those venues you're going. I don't think there's much. Sydney to Newcastle is probably a bus trip, but maybe it would be. But all the rest are going to be, you're going to the airport, and once you're on the plane, it's another hour, and like 1,000 kilometres is another hour on the plane or whatever it is. So it's more academic. The fact that you've got to go to the airport, that's a lost training day. And you've got to re-establish yourself, whereas in the past, you've been in a hotel for 3 weeks and you've just had all your stuff set up, your team rooms set up, your physios all set up, and you just come and go like a home. That's a big difference. You've got your own gym, and so it's just like being in your own training venue for 3 or 4 weeks. That's very different now. This is going to be, different venues, etc. Pack your bags, move all your gear, and I can guarantee you there's at least 2 ton of gear that's got to go. So there's all of that. That's a full day. And then you've got to set it all up the other end and keep going. So, so it's with the nature of Australia is you're going to have to travel, but the real question was whether it was going to be a home-based scenario, or or the scenario we've got where everyone's on the move, and the fan base has got to move too. If you want to watch, if you're a Hong Kong supporter, you got some travel. You got some frequent flyer points coming, Yeah.
Indeed. Well, Dom Varley, you may, if you've got time, have a look at the turnaround times as well, and let's see where that advantage lies. But if you want to jump onto the Rugby Unity Substack, you can see all of the distances travelled by the teams in the preliminary rounds. We do have the Super Bowl, and I have been accused of being obsessed with American football, but not so much for the game itself. I am just intrigued just how successful they have been in being able to turn this sport into a giant business. And so the Super Bowl, the Times of London had some good reporting over the weekend, and some of the stats that I took out of it, that the global television audience will be anywhere between 120 and 200 million. The average ticket price, $8,500 US. A 30-second television advertisement, $8 million up to $10 million. And you can double that when you take into account talent, production, and additional ad spend. 1.48 billion chicken wings will be eaten in the USA, according to the National Chicken Council, and over $20.2 billion spent on food, drink, apparel, and decorations. That's a figure from the National Retail Federation. And gambling on the event will be $1.76 billion US, which is up almost 30% from last year. 100 million pounds of that gambling will take place in the UK. So Ewen McKenzie, a giant of a sport, and certainly gives you a sense of why World Rugby are so encouraged to want to head to North America to try to eat at the table, so to speak, of North American sport. But certainly the size and scale of the NFL is something to behold.
Well, there's no question. I mean, just the chicken wing numbers was impressive. So I think there's lots of opportunity there to there's lots of opportunity. I think World Rugby's got the right intention. It's just there's probably so many fronts to work on. You've got to, in the end, the game there is like self-generating, so it's sort of become what it is, and they're working in their environment so that they don't have to move. Whereas World Rugby's got a much bigger beast in terms of logistical beast because they're dealing with all these countries worldwide who are at different rates of development and exposure and financial maturity. So, but yeah, I think the idea of trying to get into the North American market, and you mentioned about setting up an office over there, I think that's probably quite valid. And we talked ages ago about trying to dovetail and trying to get some relationship, the flag football and whatever, trying to get some sort of relationship where we acknowledge that we're not trying to tip them off their perch or take their territory, but if there's some way you could get in underneath and just tap into some of the things that they've already got in train and be not part of it, but somehow working with an ally in that space, it's definitely worth a conversation anyway.
Yeah, well, I really do think that remains another big opportunity as a conversation with the NFL. Now that flag football is an Olympic sport, will be played at the LA Games in 28. And I can imagine that once it's in, it will not go out because the NFL will continue to invest in the sport in such a way that will ensure that it continues to be participated. And obviously the NFL continues with its global ambitions. In 2026, there'll be matches in Rio de Janeiro, Melbourne, Australia, London, and also Madrid. So the NFL on the move. Now, maybe it was last week that we went through, or perhaps the week before, we went through the global extent of the broadcast deals that are in place for Six Nations. And I couldn't for the life of me find a rolled up number anywhere. But just the couple of the numbers that I did find, that on the match between France and Ireland in France, 7.24 million people, which equates to about a 39% audience share. That's an outstanding number, really, in France, 7.24 million. And on ITV in the UK for the same match, 3.8 million. So there we have 10, almost 11 million, or just over 11 million just in the UK and France. And I think if you started to tally up the others, it would be fascinating to know just exactly what the global audience was. And indeed, for the opening, all of the three matches of the Guinness Six Nations, where France defeated Ireland 36 points to 14, Italy in the sloshing rain, 18 points, Scotland 15, and England 48, way too good for Wales. Other results over the weekend in the Rugby Europe Championship in the men, Spain 51, Netherlands 33, Portugal 47, defeated Belgium 17, Georgia 54, too good for Switzerland 3, and in what looks to be a big upset, Germany 30, defeated Romania 3. Italy 15 and Scotland A played out a 24-all draw. England A, way too good for the Ireland 15, defeating them 52 points to 14. Scotland 36 defeated Italy 10 in the under-20s. England 19 points to 16 over Wales in the under-20s. And finally, France completed a pretty tidy weekend for them with a comprehensive victory in the under-20s, defeating Ireland by 50 points to 21. In the Rugby Europe Trophy, which is the second tier in Rugby Europe, or perhaps the third tier under the Six Nations and the Rugby Europe Championship, Poland 47 defeated Denmark 6, and the Czech Republic 55 defeated Croatia 33. And in the sevens, New Zealand, the women's team, have collected their third title of the year in Perth, too good for Australia. And South Africa won the men's title, defeating Fiji. So plenty of rugby played over the weekend, Ewen, McKenzie, and plenty of results there. Certainly one that caught my eye is that, when you think about Romania back in the day, Romania were a very strong team. So to be defeated by Germany 30 points to 3, hopefully it says something about Germany and the way the sport's on the move, because I don't know, Germany sort of feels to me in many ways that it could be a very, very strong rugby union country, culturally, physically. I think it would suit the Germans, but perhaps maybe Romania have dropped off, because certainly in the early days of Rugby World Cup, Romania were very strong.
Yeah, I played against Romania in the 95 World Cup. So they have dropped off, and it took the Waratahs to Romania, and we played over there as well. So that they've been stronger. They had a lot of players playing in the French competition, but they seem to have dropped off significantly in recent times. It's all been about Georgia. Georgia sort of replaced them in terms of the pecking order, and then they just sort of kept going. So I'm not sure what's happening in the background there. There's probably other things going on, but it's disappointing because they were very powerful, very strong up front. And as I said, they were in the World Cup in 95. We played against them in the pool.
Oh, well, let's see what happens with them. And also, as I say, let's see what happens with Germany rugby. So listen, a big thanks again to all of you for joining us once again. Please keep the comments, the suggestions, whether it be on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, it's on TikTok, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, wherever it is that you're consuming the content. That fresh content is there on Substack. So go and have a look at that to understand what's going on there. But please stay involved and keep the engagement up. Ewen McKenzie, a big thanks to you for joining us once again, and also to Eddie Jones for joining us earlier in the program. But people, please be kind to each other. My name is David Pembroke, and we'll be back at the end of the week with our preview program of the second round of rugby in the Guinness Six Nations. But for the moment, it's bye for now.